Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we're going to be talking about Seamus Heaney. Now, this is just a brief introduction to one of Ireland's most famous poets, and we're going to be focusing in on the theme of place in his poetry. Before we get into the text, though, I should probably tell you something about Seamus Heaney's background. So, first of all, he was born in Castle Dawson in County Derry in 1939. Now, this is probably the start of Heaney's obsession with place and with landscape. And this is partly because the location that he was born into was very agricultural, it was very rural. His father and his family were farmers, and Heaney really admired that in his father in particular. And if you read one of Heaney's early poems called Follower, you'll see that he wants to follow in his father's wake. As a child, he's stumbling around the farm, following his father around as he's ploughing the field. However, Heaney was called to a different kind of life. He benefited from the grammar school system, and that helped him to go off to university, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, whilst Heaney was born in this very rural setting, and he writes a lot about that in his prose and in his poetry, his life took a different direction, which took him rather further afield around the world. He was born in 1939 on the cusp of the Second World War, which was declared in September of that year. So, another important detail of Heaney's life is that it spans so many decades of change, and you can see that in his poetry, which kind of progresses from this kind of obsession with the farm that he grew up on into the troubles of the late 1960s, 1970s, and then kind of through that to a sense of hope that we have after the peace process. So it spans this kind of huge kind of half a century, or more than half a century almost, in terms of his life and what he's talking about. But it's also interesting that his childhood was kind of marked by this idea of conflict. Heaney moved to Belfast in the 60s. He studied at Queen's University, and it was about then that he became known for his writing. Kind of mid 1960s, 1966 was his first volume of poetry. And as I've said, he's best known for writing about the Irish landscape and the Troubles. Now, it's the landscape that we're going to focus on today. There's a lot that could be said about Heaney writing about the Troubles, but I think that's a discussion for a separate time. He held a variety of teaching posts, including professorships at Harvard and Oxford universities. And one of the things I love about Heaney is not just his poetry, but also how he communicated his poetic vision. And he talked about other poets, he lectured about other poets that he really admired. And he was really keen on education and young people and getting the next generation interested in poetry. So he's got a volume of essays about his poetry and about other poets, which is called Finders Keepers, and it's a really fabulous insight into his thinking on the topic of poetry. He was described as the most important Irish poet since Yeats. This is American poet Robert Lowell talking about Heaney, and I think that probably still stands. Irish poetry's really kind of flourished in the last kind of 40 years. We have Yeats in the 1930s, 1940s, and then there was a bit of a lull, although if you want to know about what happened in that time period, you can read my PhD thesis. But from the 1960s onwards, we have this huge flowering of poetry in Northern Ireland, and Heaney was right at the centre of that movement. Heaney then died in 2013. So let's start looking at some of his work then. And what I've got on the screen here is a list of titles of his different collections of poetry. And I want you to just pause the video and think to yourself, well, what do you notice about these titles? So what themes do they suggest? What interests do they suggest? And then do the titles change, progress as Heaney's career progresses? So pause the video, have a bit of a chat about that, and then start the video again when you're ready. Okay, so in terms of things that I notice about these titles, the first thing is the centrality of place and nature. We see that all the way through his collections. Death of a Naturalist, obviously naturalist kind of announces Heaney's interest in the landscape, although the word death might qualify that slightly. Then we've got Wintering Out, we've got this sense of kind of exposure in the natural world. North suggests a real interest in the north of Ireland and in different countries in the Northern Hemisphere. Heaney was really interested in what are called the bog people, so dead bodies of people who were maybe sacrificed hundreds of years ago in kind of northern cultures. So you see some of them in Denmark. You also see in Ireland, there's the body of an elk, for example, that's being preserved in a bog. And Heaney was really interested in that kind of preservation in the bog landscapes that are quite particular to Northern Europe. Field work, obviously, kind of tapping into that sense of agriculture. After that, then we have a bit of a change to themes that are maybe more esoteric, more philosophical interactions with place. So perhaps less of a focus on describing particular places or particular aspects of the landscape, and more to consideration of how humans interact with the world that they're in on a more philosophical level. Obviously, we have some of that earlier in the poetry, but it comes to dominate in his later works. So Seeing Things, for example, from 1991 is a really interesting collection of poems. As the title suggests, it's partly about our perception of the natural world, or is seeing things, it's a common phrase for saying that you see an illusion or you're kind of imagining things. So it's also about the imagination as well, and how we imagine the world that we're in. District and Circle, is perhaps an allusion to the tube stations in London and that kind of thing. So there's a bit of a shift as we get towards the later volumes of poetry. Well, I mentioned earlier that Heaney writes a lot of prose about place, about his poetry, about other poets, and so on. So let's have a look at some of the things that he's told us that he's interested in relation to the concept of place. And this all kind of centres around one word, which is omphalos. Now, this is a Greek word. It means the centre. Or in ancient Greece, it's a stone that marks the center of the world. So the Oracle of Delphi had one of these stones in it. And Heaney describes this stone in an essay called Mossbawn, which is in Finders Keepers. So it's the idea that this is the kind of root, the starting point of absolutely everything. It's sometimes described as being the navel of the world too. And for Heaney, this omphalos is the water pump at the family farm in Mossbawn in County Derry. Now, that might seem a little bit surprising, but one of the things that Heaney's really keen to do in his early poetry is really kind of root his poems in his local landscape where he was growing up. And it almost kind of taps into a lot of our expectations of poetry. If we think about Keats and Wordsworth and Shelley, perhaps the UK's most famous poets, you think about how they describe the natural world. Well, Heaney's doing that, but he's bringing that into Northern Ireland in a way that perhaps wasn't done before. And it's that sound, omphalos, 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 which he connects with the pumping of the water pump in his family farm. So there's a connection with his upbringing, with the family farm, with Northern Ireland, with County Derry. There's also a connection with this idea of work, because as that water pump pumps, and he kind of almost imagines that he hears omphalos, omphalos, omphalos as it pumps, there's a kind of idea of work, whether that's domestic work or whether that's work on the farm as well. And Heaney talks about this not just in that essay from Finders Keepers, but also in a poem called Alphabets, which you have a chance, you should really stop and read. It's absolutely beautiful, and one of his later poems. And in Alphabets, he starts from the point of view of being a small child, learning to read, and goes all the way through to his lectureships at Oxford and Harvard. And he talks about how in the classroom he sees the globe. Well, if we think about omphalos, that letter O, then mimicked in the shape of the globe. Then he learns the letter O when he's at primary school. He talks about the wooden O of the lecture theatre as he stands maybe in Harvard giving lectures in these centres of learning. And he also talks about the sun being shaped like the letter O, and the sun being the kind of natural phenomenon that we derive all of our life from. So everything that Heaney says about place goes back to this concept of the omphalos, which goes back to his family farm and then stretches off to Oxford and Harvard and then stretches out, cosmically to the sun. But it all comes back to the family farm in County Derry. And Heaney says in this essay in Mossbawn, that pump marked an original descent into the earth, sand, gravel, water. It centered and staked the imagination, made its foundations the foundation of the omphalos itself. So as this water pump is kind of put down into the ground, it goes right the way into the heart of things. And the way Heaney says it staked the imagination, no matter how far he travels geographically, intellectually, academically, in his poetry, everything comes back to this point. Um, so this kind of links in really nicely with his first collection of poems that we've kind of glanced at already, which is called Death of a Naturalist from 1966. Now, one thing to note here is that this is before the most serious kind of outbreak of the Troubles. Some people kind of confuse this collection a little bit and link it in with the Troubles, but that hasn't happened yet historically, in terms of kind of the 1969 period onwards. So Death of a Naturalist is very much about Heaney's family home, and he talks about those really childhood foundational memories in poems like Blackberry Picking, Digging, and Churning Day. These are really beautiful poems where he's talking about the things that he did, that his parents did on the family farm, kind of describing a way of life which I suppose was starting to disappear to some extent in the 1940s and the post-war period. And in one of the poems in that collection is called Personal Helicon. Now, helicon, like omphalos, is a Greek word, and it comes from Greek mythology. And this is Mount Helicon in Greece. And on that mountain, there was a belief that there were two springs sacred to the Muses. Now, the Muses are kind of mystical beings that poets would appeal to in order to get poetic inspiration. And there's one spring in particular, the Hippocrene spring, which was associated with this idea of poetic inspiration. So Heaney brings this rather kind of esoteric, academic reference into Northern Ireland. And he says, I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. Now, this in this poem, he's talking about the well in the family farm rather than the water pump itself. But again, it's this idea of going down into the earth to pull the water up out of it. And you can almost kind of imagine the child learning what the imagination is, going down into the imagination to pull ideas out of that. And there's something really exciting about that. But there's also something quite daunting. There's the trepidation of the unknown. What are you going to pull out of the earth? And in this particular poem, you have the metaphor of the child looking down into the well and seeing all sorts of kind of slimy things down the well, also seeing his own face. So it's the idea that he could get to know himself better, but he could also discover things that are a little bit unpleasant. Just like if you go down into the imagination or the subconscious or the psyche or your own past, you can get to know yourself better, but at the same time, you might unearth some other things as well. So he says, I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. And that quotation really becomes central to Heaney's whole poetry. The reason why he's rhyming, why he's creating these poems, is in order to find out more about himself, more about the history of the landscape, more about the place in which he lives. Okay, so we're going to jump towards the end of Heaney's career, and I think it's probably time for a bit of a pause as well, because I've been talking a lot, and we're going to look at a poem called Postscript. But before we do that, just pause the video and think, right, postscript, what does that mean? What does that suggest to you? And then start the video again when you've had a bit of a think. Okay, so postscript at the end of a letter, PS, the kind of bit of information that comes last that's almost forgotten, but actually is so important because you don't want to forget to say that. If you look at Heaney's collected poems, it's called Opened Ground, which in itself is a comment about place. And this is the last poem in that collection, so it's almost like this kind of final thought in his collected poetry. So this poem is set in County Clare, and it's about kind of driving along through the landscape, and as they're driving along, the wind is buffeting the car. So whereas the early poems, Death of a Naturalist, are quite claustrophobic, quite close, there's a sense of kind of darkness and danger as the child discovers the natural world that he lives in. He discovers the excitement of the natural world, but also there's a sense of fear of the unknown. What is he quite going to find out about himself, about the place where he lives? Postscript seems a lot more open, a lot more airy. There's a lot of light, and you've got this sense of kind of the wind hitting the car, which if you've ever been on the west coast of Ireland, there's nothing like kind of looking out into the Atlantic and feeling that kind of wind coming off the Atlantic. So one thing that we see in poetry a lot is this idea of kind of coasts and mountains being liminal or thin spaces. So liminal is almost that space between, you're on a threshold between one world and the next, or one place and the next. So a beach, for example, or a coast is liminal because it's between the sea and the land. The peak of a mountain is liminal because you're between the land and the sky. And these are often described, as I've said, as thin places. Now, this is quite a religious concept, quite common if you know anything about kind of saints and medieval theology in Northumberland in England, which is where the word thin places is often used. And it's almost like you can feel that you can reach out and touch another world, whether that be the world of the imagination, whether that be a more spiritual world. So what Heaney talks about in this particular poem is that as he's driving along the coast of County Clare, the wind's hitting the car, and it's a place that's neither here nor there. It's liminal. It's between one settlement and another settlement. It's between the land and the sea, but it's also between the kind of physical reality that we are in and some more kind of spiritual reality beyond ourselves, or it's between the physical place and the imagination. So there's all sorts of ways of interpreting what ostensibly seems like quite a simple phrase. And then the last line of the poem is absolutely phenomenal. And he talks about how this wind hits the car, and then he says it catches the heart off guard and blows it open. So again, we're moving from the physical into the spiritual, into the emotional, the psychological realm. And that's one of the things that Heaney's poetry really attempts to achieve, is kind of blowing the heart open, like showing what's going on in the inner workings of the heart, the inner workings of the imagination, and thinking about how that kind of identity, that sense of self, that kind of psychological imagination aspect of each individual links in with the place and that they are most connected with. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you very much. We're glad that I didn't talk about the troubles, because that would have added a whole other 20 minutes to this video. But thank you very much for listening.